Hello everyone, thanks for joining us for this webinar on the topic of choosing the right microscope for live blood analysis. I am your presenter Elizabeth Clemens from Live Blood Online, where we offer online training courses for live and dry blood analysis. We teach practitioners from all over the world, and if you'd like to know more, please see our website www.livebloodonline.com. And we get many questions regarding choosing the right microscope. So Dr. Ocker, our course tutor and microscope expert, is here to explain the importance of knowing exactly what is needed for live and dry blood analysis, and also to help you avoid making any expensive mistakes. So we'll be answering your questions throughout as well as at the end. So please locate the questions box in your GoToWebinar panel and type your questions in there. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Ocker now. Thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Ocker. Why is it important to view this webinar before buying a microscope?
All right. Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and welcome everyone. Well, for many practitioners, Elizabeth, using a microscope is a completely new experience. As practitioners, we are usually trained in nutrition and herbal medicine and other natural modalities that help us to help our clients, but we're not normally trained in microscopy. And when you start researching microscopes, you actually find that this is a very complex field with its own terminology or language, if you like, just like any other discipline. Now, normally when we need to invest in a piece of equipment, we rely on the expertise of the people who work in the field to make the best decision. Now, the challenge is, however, that many microscope suppliers simply do not know what is required of a microscope system to perform live blood analysis properly.
Yes, that's quite surprising, isn't it? When you look at all the different microscope systems that are available, many of them claiming to be Darkfield microscopes. Some of these systems are very cheap as well. We often have attendees ask us if these would be suitable for live blood analysis. Why are these cheaper microscopes not suitable?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's one of the questions that we'd like to address specifically in this webinar. I'm sure that you'll agree that it's very important to have a suitable microscope system, because if you don't, you simply won't be able to see what you should be able to see in the blood. The risk is that with a cheaper system, you may end up with a Darkfield image that looks like this example that we're going to show you now. All right, so this is the type of image that you're likely to get with a cheaper type of microscope system. Some of these ones that are available online for a couple of $100, and they claim to be able to do Darkfield, but this is usually the type of image that you'll get in live blood. Now, typically the specifications are a 20-watt light source, which is really critical with a blood analysis microscope. The type of light source is often really crucial to what you're going to see under the microscope. And this is using a 40 times objective and also with a dry Darkfield condenser and the standard type of on-screen magnification that you would get with most laboratory microscopes. Now, if we compare that to what you're actually supposed to see in the same live blood sample with the right type of microscope system, you can see it's a huge difference.
Yeah, you can definitely see a huge difference between the images. So what are the main differences between the systems then?
Right, well, as I mentioned, the first system uses a 20-watt light source. It is a 20-watt standard laboratory microscope. Now, this system would have all the standard specifications for routine laboratory use with none of the specific type of features needed for proper live blood analysis. So it has a 20-watt halogen light source, a dry Darkfield condenser, and the standard on-screen type of magnification with these microscopes. Now, the second image, on the other hand, is from the HD LED microscope. Now, the one important difference for this microscope is the light source. There's a 9-watt LED light source, which is equivalent to about 100 watts halogen. So it's much, much brighter. And then we use an oil immersion Darkfield condenser. And then also the third point is there's increased on-screen magnification. You can actually see that very clearly by looking at the two images. The size of the cells much bigger on the example on the right-hand side. So we have a total magnification on screen using the 40 times objective, the same objective used in the example on the left-hand side. But this magnification we achieve on screen is 1,600 times versus the 400 times magnification that we get with the standard system on the left. Now we'll go into detail in each of these features to show you how they actually affect what you're able to see in the blood. The most important factor that sets these microscopes apart and determines the price is actually how well they manage with Darkfield. Now, there are a very strict set of requirements for Darkfield analysis of live blood specifically. Many of these microscopes do have Darkfield capabilities, and they do claim to be able to you know, that you should be able to use them for Darkfield. But when it actually comes to analyzing live blood, they're not really suitable. So I don't believe that it's really a case of the microscope suppliers intentionally trying to deceive people, you know, claiming to sell these Darkfield microscopes that are not really suitable for Darkfield. It's simply that they don't know what is required for viewing live blood properly in Darkfield.
I see, thank you. So our course is not exclusively based on Darkfield analysis. We have many live blood anomalies that have examples in both bright field and dark field. And dry blood analysis is of course only done in bright field. So how important a role does dark field really play in live and dry blood analysis?
Well, Darkfield analysis or being able to analyze blood properly in Darkfield really does play a critical role in live blood analysis. Now, there are some anomalies that can only be seen in bright field and some that can only be seen in Darkfield. And this is why we always look at a blood sample first in bright field before going over to Darkfield. However, I usually would spend around 10 minutes in bright field because there's just so much more that we can see in dark field. So the balance of the analysis is all done in dark field. And often the anomalies that we see in dark field are fundamental to the case, and they actually determine the direction then taken in terms of treatment of a case. So if you're not able to view blood properly in dark field, you would then potentially miss all those other anomalies, and the treatment that you decide on then in the case may not really be the best and most appropriate for your client.
I see. And this would also affect your experience as a practitioner with live blood analysis, wouldn't it? Because you may not see the results you expect to see in practice.
Well, that's absolutely true. You know, this is a very important potential pitfall to watch out for when incorporating live blood analysis into your practice. It's really critical that you have the correct system right from the start. You know, nobody really wants poor results, not the practitioner, and certainly not the client. Now, I was very fortunate when I started analyzing blood that I was able to start from the very beginning with a very good quality microscope, very similar to the standard 50-watt halogen units that we have now. And over the years, I've seen consistent, great results with live blood analysis in my practice, and I have no doubt of its ability to highlight the most important issues in a case. Now, the two main reasons why some practitioners don't see the results that they expect to see with live blood analysis is firstly their level of training. You know, if they're not familiar with all the possible anomalies and what they mean, then they won't be able to use live blood analysis properly. And secondly, if their microscope system isn't suitable for live blood analysis, then it really doesn't matter if they are familiar with all the anomalies. You know, if they're not able to see them, it still doesn't really help.
Okay, thank you. So in the invitation for this webinar, we mentioned that not all microscopes are created equally. And as we mentioned earlier, some microscope systems are very cheap, whilst the microscopes used for live blood analysis tend to be more costly. So what are the reasons for the higher price tag on live blood analysis microscopes?
Well, one of the factors would be supply and demand. You know, microscopes that are mass-produced, your standard laboratory microscopes, are usually much cheaper. Now these tend to have all the same standard specifications that all normal laboratory microscopes have. And none of them are actually suitable for live blood analysis. Where a microscope system has been manufactured also plays a role. Generally, microscopes produced in China are much cheaper. Most of the microscopes that are available online are actually from China, even those sold on some of the websites in the USA. The main problem with these Chinese microscopes is not that all of them are of an inferior quality. Some of them are actually quite good, but many of them are not good at all, and it's really not always possible to tell them apart, you know, when shopping online. And that really is the main problem. So here it comes down to the components that are used within the microscope. Now, I've seen microscopes where the actual gears in the focusing mechanism in the microscope were actually made of cast iron. Now, usually these components are made of harder wearing materials such as brass because, you know, of the constant wear on these parts. Cast iron gears are, of course, much cheaper to manufacture, but they're really not going to last long at all.
Wow, that's a bit shocking. Reliability is obviously very important because you're going to be using your microscope every day on each and every client, and the last thing you need is for it to suddenly stop working, yeah?
Absolutely, yes. And because it's such a specialized tool, it's unlikely that you'll have another one lying around that you could then use.
Definitely. So build quality and the quality of the internal components are some of the factors. What are the other factors that determine the cost of a microscope?
Well, other than the build quality, there are quite a few other factors. Now, I'll discuss them, and I'll have to get a little bit more technical and resort to using some of the terminology used in microscopy here, but I'll explain everything as we go along. So firstly, let's talk about the objectives. Now, on a microscope, the objectives are the lenses that are usually found just above the stage that provide the different and determine also the different levels of magnification. Now, the basic entry level type of objective are called achromatic. Now, this means that only the central 60% or so of the image will be focused and color corrected. The remaining 40% around the edges will actually appear blurry. In the slightly more expensive semi-plan objectives, the central 80% of the image will be focused, and the most expensive objectives are called plan achromatic, and they produce an image that is 100% flat, in focus, and color corrected. So what they mean with color corrected objectives is that all the colors of the spectrum will be visible in the viewing field. So in the cheapest objectives, the achromatic objectives, only the central 60% of the field of view will be color corrected. Now this means that the color of objects around that area would actually not be correct. The other important issue then also with regards to objectives is the numerical aperture. Now this simply determines how much light an objective will allow through. This is actually quite standard for most objectives, and when it comes to Darkfield, we actually need a much lower aperture than the standard one used for a large 100 times objective. Now, if you use a standard 100 times oil immersion objective for Darkfield, you would not really be able to see much at all unless you're able to adjust the aperture. So to reduce the amount of light allowed through. The most expensive 100 times objectives come with a built-in iris diaphragm that then allows you to adjust the aperture. Without this feature, the 100 times objective is actually of very little use in live blood analysis. As I mentioned, the 100 times objectives that have this feature, this built-in iris diaphragm, are actually very expensive. They normally sell for around $300 or so. And that's really just for the objective, which is, more than what some of these cheaper microscopes go for. Now we actually have an example of a live blood sample in Darkfield using a normal planar achromatic 100 times oil immersion objective. This is the cheaper one without the built-in iris diaphragm, and you can see there's actually very little that you can tell from this image. You can see that there might be some cells in this field of view, but there's very little that you can actually see from this. Compared to the image that we would get with a 100 times objective with a built-in iris diaphragm, that is really more what we would expect to see. You can clearly see the difference. The objective without the iris diaphragm just allows through too much light. So there's just far too much reflected light in the sample, which then makes it basically impossible to see anything at all.
So the amount of light that the objectives allow through plays an important role then, especially in this 100 times objective. The type of Darkfield condenser you use also affects how much light is allowed through into the sample, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes, that's a very important point. When it comes to the type of Darkfield condenser, the oil immersion type is the only one that you really should use for live blood analysis. Now the reason for that is again related to the amount of light allowed through into the sample, which then determines what you'll ultimately be able to see in the sample. So there are two types of Darkfield condensers. There's the type that uses oil, an oil immersion Darkfield condenser, which is the type we recommend, and then there's this type, which is the dry Darkfield condenser. Now, this is an example of an image of live blood in Darkfield using this dry Darkfield condenser. And this is with a fairly good quality microscope. This is a 9-watt LED microscope. So there's enough brightness coming from the light source, but because the dry Darkfield condenser allows through too much light, we don't really get that type of definition that we expect to see normally in a proper Darkfield image. So if we compare that to the Darkfield image using an oil immersion condenser, so that is actually what we should be able to see. So as you can see with the dry Darkfield condenser, you're not really able to see much detail between the cells and inside the cells. And this is the same blood sample that we've used here. So you can clearly see that the dry condenser, we can't really see any target cells or any chylomicrons, whereas with the oil immersion condenser, the target cells and the chylomicrons are actually very clearly visible. Now, if there was anything less reflective than these chylomicrons, like for example fibrin or signs of fermentation or any of the pleomorphic growth forms, you would not have seen that with the dry condenser.
Yeah, that's quite clear. Both of these images were taken with the same microscope, the only difference being the type of Darkfield condenser used. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
So the brightness of the lamp or light source plays an important role as well then, does it?
Absolutely it does. It is actually one of the most important factors that determines whether a system will be suitable for live blood analysis, and this is usually the first thing to check when looking at a microscope to see whether it will work for live blood analysis. Now, most of your normal microscopes, and this is easily 95% or more of microscopes that are available out there, have a 20-watt lamp. Now, this is nearly not bright enough for Darkfield analysis. Some so-called Darkfield microscopes have a 30-watt lamp or a 3-watt halogen lamp, but even this is still not bright enough. To be able to see the structures that you really want to see in Darkfield, you will need at least a 50-watt halogen lamp. Now this will produce enough brightness to illuminate the small and fine structures between the cells. Anything less than 50 watt will not produce enough brightness, and you'll essentially just see what you saw in bright field, but against a dark background.
Okay, so the standard 50 watt system that we recommend is a 50 watt halogen system, but the most popular system is actually the LED system. So what level of brightness does the LED system produce then?
Well, the LED system has a 9-watt LED lamp. Now, this is equivalent to almost 100-watt halogen. So it's even brighter, provides twice the amount of brightness than the 50-watt halogen system. Now, there are some LED microscopes available out there, but again, looking at them, 99% or so of them will have a 3-watt LED lamp, which is again not nearly bright enough for dark field. Now the 9-watt LED is actually quite unique to our systems. You won't really find that in any other microscope system with LED. I've not come across any other systems with the same strength of LED light source. The only equivalent that you would be able to find then would be a 100-watt fiber optic cold light source. So, for us, just to illustrate here the differences in what you'll see in dark field based on the strength of your light source alone, we have a few examples here. So this is an image here of live blood with a standard 20-watt halogen microscope using a dry dark field condenser. And there's the increased on-screen magnification there. So we're looking at 1,600 times magnification. Now, if we compare that to the next image where an oil immersion condenser was used, but this is also with a 20-watt light source, you can see that the dry condenser does allow through more light, so the image is slightly brighter than this image, but we're still nowhere near to what we should be seeing in dark field, which is the next image. So compared on there, you can actually see the image on the left-hand side is with a dry dark field condenser, which is allows through more light, but it doesn't allow you to see all the detail that you should be able to see in dark field, which is in the next image that we're going to look at now. So this is with the LED microscope with a 9-watt LED, equivalent to about 100-watt halogen, with a 40-watt objective and the oil immersion dark field condenser.
Very interesting. The magnification range is also quite important, isn't it? Live blood analysis requires a different setup with regards to the magnification to the camera as well. Could you explain what is required here, please?
Well, absolutely, yes. This is, again, a very important feature, and one that will also play a very big role in one's ability to observe all the anomalies in the blood properly. Now, normal microscope systems are set up in such a way that the magnification that you get on the screen, so the magnification through the camera tube to the camera, is the same as the magnification that you have through the eyepieces. Now, in most situations, this makes sense, but in live blood analysis we actually need a magnification of at least 1,000 times on the screen when we're analyzing a live blood sample. Anything below that won't allow you to see enough detail in the cells properly to be able to distinguish between the different type of anomalies. So if you have a standard microscope setup, to achieve a 1,000 times magnification on the screen, you would need to use a 100 times objective. Now, if your objective is not that expensive type that we mentioned before with the built-in iris diaphragm, you wouldn't really be able to see very much at all on the screen, which means that inevitably you'd have to use the 40 times objective, which would only give you a magnification of 400 times on the screen, so far below the minimum requirement of 1,000 times. So what we've done with our live blood analysis systems is to actually increase the magnification to the screen 4 times. So this means that if you're using the 40 times objective, The magnification through the eyepieces will be 400, but on the screen will be 1,600 times, which is really ideal for live blood analysis. Now, the other benefit of this is because the 40 times objective that we use doesn't use any oil, you're also then able to switch back to a smaller objective, and if you still need to scan around the sample a bit, and then you also still have the 100 times objective that you can then use if you need to really zoom into a particular cell or microorganism, which is something often used when looking for spirochetes and alpha-form bacteria and so on. Using the 100 times objective will then give you an on-screen magnification of 4,000 times, which really is very unusual for microscopes. But of course, it's actually ideal for live blood analysis. So just to illustrate this, we have a few images here just of a specific area of interest in the blood, in a live blood sample. Now this first image is with the standard on-screen magnification that you would get with most other microscope systems. This is about 400 times magnification, also using a 20-watt microscope and a 40-watt objective with the oil Darkfield condenser. Now, if we look at the monocyte here, the white blood cell at the center of the screen there, using our system with the additional on-screen magnification and the stronger light source, you can actually see in the next example, if you consider what that monocyte looked like in the previous image, there's the monocyte there towards the left-hand side. So you can actually see the difference very, very clearly. The monocyte is much larger, and we can actually now see all these other anomalies around the monocyte that weren't visible before. These little small bubbles in the background there that relate to fermentation. Seeing this in a case would indicate the need for a candida type of protocol. And if you didn't have a system to show you that, you wouldn't actually have picked that up at all. So then finally, if we wanted to increase the magnification even more to the maximum level, using the 100 times objective, you would achieve a 4,000 times magnification on the screen. This is the type of image that you would be getting. So, you really can see the size of that monocyte there.
Wow, you can really see the difference that the additional magnification makes. So being able to show clients a live video feed of their blood on a screen is really central to live blood analysis, isn't it? And this is, of course, achieved by attaching a camera to the microscope. Now, I've seen microscopes that have cameras attached to an eyepiece, but the recommended way is to have a separate camera tube in the microscope. Is that correct?
Oh yes, definitely. Connecting a camera to one of the eyepieces is really not the ideal way of doing it, because you are really just sacrificing one of your eyepieces, and because the camera then being used there, it makes it nearly impossible to use the other eyepiece. The best, as you said, is to have a dedicated camera tube in the head of the microscope. Now, the term that is used for these types of microscopes is trinocular, whereas the microscopes that don't have a separate camera tube are called binocular.
Okay, thank you. And the type of camera connected to the microscope is also quite important, isn't it? Is there as much variation in the types of cameras available for microscopes as well?
Well, yes, there is. And again, we see a fairly wide price range here between the different types of cameras. The first thing to look out for is whether the camera has been built specifically for microscopy. Now, this is important because if it's not specifically a microscope camera, then you'll often end up having these spots on the screen that you just won't be able to get off. Now, these are minute imperfections on the components in and in front of the camera sensor, and if they're there, there really is no way of getting rid of them. I've tested many cameras, and some of them had so many spots on the screen that you're really not able to see anything in the blood clearly at all. This really is quite frustrating when when you have to struggle with that. And manufacturers and suppliers of these cameras are usually quite shocked when they see this, themselves, because when the camera is used normally, for the purpose that it was designed for, with a lens attached in front of it, you're not able to see any type of spots. But mounting it on the microscope, these actually become really very obvious. We actually have an example here. So I had to look through some of the older images of some of the older cameras that we tested to find an example of what these spots look like. So this is an example of live blood just in bright field, and you can see some of these spots visible here. There's actually quite a large number of them. All the little arrows are pointing to the main ones, and there's still a few others in the background that we didn't have arrows pointing to. So as you can see, there are really quite a few spots here, and I've actually also seen much worse. But you can imagine using a camera like this on your microscope. It really is going to affect how you will be able to use your microscope. And you probably would get used to seeing the spots after a while, and you probably would learn to ignore them. But each and every client that you get will ask you what these spots are, and this can become quite frustrating. Now this image that we have next is with an HD camera that's specifically developed for microscopy. And you can see the difference there, not just in the absence of spots, but also just the quality of the image and the color, the appearance of the colors here. All right, so the next thing in terms of these cameras to look out for is not only the resolution. Most people are quite familiar with the resolution of cameras and what they should be looking for, but also very important to look at the frame rate. Now the frame rate is how many frames the camera produces per second, usually abbreviated as FPS, which stands for frames per second. Now in digital cameras, the higher the resolution, the lower the frame rate usually is. Now there are digital cameras that have an extremely high resolution, 10 megapixels for example, but they then have a frame rate of 5 frames per second. And this means that the video then that you'll see on the screen when you're looking through the blood sample will not be smooth at all. These cameras are actually better suited to applications where there isn't really much movement of the object that you're viewing. Ideally, a camera should have a frame rate of at least 25 frames per second, which actually narrows down your options of high definition digital cameras quite dramatically.
Okay, and does Darkfield play a role in your choice of camera as well?
Well, yes, it does. But also just the fact that we're viewing samples both in bright field and dark field, the camera needs to be able to adjust its exposure levels properly between dark field and bright field. This is not always achieved by the camera automatically, so often one would need to adjust these settings then in the camera's software. And this then just becomes another factor to consider because some cameras don't have the most user-friendly software available, and it becomes quite tedious to have to adjust these settings.
Yes, indeed, and also not all of them are compatible with all operating systems, are they?
Absolutely. This is also another important factor. This compatibility really does narrow down the list of options quite drastically, because not all cameras are compatible with both Windows and Mac, and some cameras don't even support Windows 8.
Wow. So there are quite a number of factors to consider when choosing a microscope for live blood analysis, and it seems that Darkfield plays a very important role here. You mentioned earlier that there are many anomalies that can only be seen in Darkfield and that these may be very important to the treatment of a case. Could you tell us a little bit more about this and which anomalies are only visible in Darkfield?
Yes, absolutely. So, some people, when they hear Darkfield, immediately think of pleomorphism and, choose not to use a Darkfield system because they're not really using pleomorphism in the analysis. But there are actually many other very important anomalies that are not part of pleomorphism, but that can only be seen in dark field. So the first one that comes to mind is fibrin, a very important finding, which is of course related to liver stress. We see this in many live blood samples, and often would be really important in terms of treatment and management of a case. And fibrin would only really be visible in bright field if it's about a grade 5 out of 5, and you wouldn't really see the full extent of it in bright field. It might appear like a grade of 2 out of 5 in bright field, when in fact it's a 5 out of 5. So it really is very important to be able to see this clearly in dark field. Secondly, chylomicrons. Now those are those small motile particles that move around actively in the plasma. Chylomicrons are only really visible in dark field. And then also most of your white cell anomalies are only really visible in dark field. So for example, when assessing the lobes within neutrophils, so when you're looking for things like neutrophil band cells, hypersegmented neutrophils, empty white blood cells, looking at white blood cell viability, so whether the neutrophils actually move and whether the granules are moving, that's something that you're only really going to be able to see in dark field. And also very importantly, the white blood cell count. So the granulocyte estimation that we mentioned in one of the lessons, where you get an estimation of the white blood cell count by looking through the eyepieces with a 20 times objective, that can only really be done in dark field because the white blood cells are quite bright and they're very obvious then when looking through the eyepieces. In bright field, that really is completely impossible. Now we're also able to see target cells much more clearly in dark field, and it's easier to distinguish between the various types of crystals in dark field. And there are also certain microbes like the L-form bacteria that also can't be seen in bright field. And then the last point probably to make here would be, that even if you're not planning on using pleomorphism, I still believe that this is very important, just to be able to see the various pleomorphic growth forms, because they tell us so much about the state of the terrain. I've seen many clients where the anomalies seen in live blood in bright field were not all that unusual, but under then a high number of very advanced pleomorphic growth forms were seen in dark field, which then indicates that the treatment of the case needs to be more focused and specific to improving the terrain, and the progress in these cases will tend to be much slower because of the length of time that the terrain has been compromised for.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dr. Ocker. Very interesting. We do have,
thank you.
Yeah, we do have quite a few questions here. Please pop your questions in the box, and we will endeavour to answer them. What about the general upkeep of microscopes? Can you tell us a little bit about how much maintenance they need?
Well, they actually don't really require that much maintenance. If you use them properly for their intended purpose, they don't really require much maintenance. The lenses and the components are usually fixed in the microscope in a way that where they won't really move and dust won't really get into the components of the microscope. You would need to keep the stage clean, so free of dust and free of oil. So you would need to at the end of the day, or perhaps before your analysis in the day, make sure that the stage is clean and wipe off any oil with an alcohol swab. And usually we would find a little bit of dust collecting on the field iris diaphragm. This is the area in the base of the microscope where the light comes through from the light source. So you'll see a little bit of dust collecting on there. It doesn't really affect the what you're able to see unless it really becomes a very thick layer of dust. But this is something that also should just be wiped off with a clean cloth from time to time. We do supply the microscopes with dust covers, so at the end of the day, when you've finished with the analysis, you can place the dust cover over the microscope, and that will prevent dust from getting onto the stage and so on.
Okay, thank you. And how long do halogen bulbs last?
Well, halogen bulbs usually would last, depending on how frequently you use the microscope, we usually find people have to replace the halogen bulb at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. And the halogen bulbs are not extremely expensive, but they usually tend to go while you're busy with the client, so you have to interrupt the session and then replace the light bulb. And in most cases, practitioners would have forgotten where they left the spare, so it causes a bit of panic. So that's also why most people tend to opt for the LED system.
Okay, thank you. And could you please tell our attendees about the microscopes that we provide on the website, as well as the entry-level microscope that we make available for our attendees? Could you explain a little bit about that, please?
All right. Absolutely. So we've put together microscopes specifically for blood analysis, so that you're able to see everything that you should be able to see, everything that you've learned about in the course with your microscope system. It has all the required specifications to be able to look at blood samples in bright field and dark field. All 4 of the models that are available will allow you to see everything that you should be able to see in the blood properly. The differences between these 4 units really just boils down to the type of light source and the type of camera. So the first option that you can see there, the HD LED dark field microscope, has the 9-watt LED light source and the high definition HDMI USB camera. And then there's different combinations. We have a standard definition LED microscope. We have a high definition 50-watt microscope, 50-watt halogen, and then we have a standard definition camera with a 50-watt halogen light source as well. So those are the 4 units that are available. You can see the prices there in US dollars, and we do have an entry-level type of system that we've also put together, that basically we've designed the entry level for practitioners that are not able to afford the microscopes with all the specifications. So we've taken off some of the really non-essential features, and to provide the microscope that still allows you to see everything that you should be able to see in dark field, and to use blood analysis properly without sacrificing any of the quality on the microscope. So the entry-level system, instead of having 5 objectives, only has 3 objectives. It has a 4 times objective, a 10 times objective, and a 40 times objective. So it's not supplied with the 20 times objective and the 100 times objective. As I mentioned earlier, that 100 times objective is quite costly. So that does affect the price if we don't include it in the system. That allows us to reduce the price quite dramatically. And the 100 times objective, because of the additional magnification that we have on the screen, is not something that we use that often. Most of the analysis is actually done with the 40 times objective. And the 20 times objective is also not as critical as the others. There are spaces available in the nose piece of the entry-level microscope that will allow you to upgrade and add those objectives at a later stage. So that option is available. And the other difference with the entry-level is that it has a standard definition camera, and it has a 7-watt LED light source instead of the 9-watt LED. So not quite as bright as the top of the range LED system, but still bright enough, even brighter than the 50-watt, to allow you to see everything that you should be able to see in dark field. The entry level goes for just under $4,000. It's $3,775, so significantly cheaper than the other units.
Thank you. And where are the microscopes made?
Well, that's a very good question, because we did mention the quality of some of the microscopes from China. Our microscopes are actually manufactured in Japan. So we have a microscope manufacturer there, a factory that manufactures a wide range of microscopes, but they manufacture the microscopes for us for blood analysis under contract according to our own specifications. So that's why we're able to provide these features that are not really available in other types of microscopes. Now, the microscope optics that are used in these microscopes are based on Nikon optics. So in terms of quality, it really is really very good.
And how does your brand compare to Olympus, for example?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting one, because we've often had people that did another type of course in blood analysis, perhaps one where phase contrast and bright field is taught, and they ended up purchasing an Olympus microscope. And some of the common models that are used then would be the CX. The CX41 is quite a well-known one. And when you look at the specifications, the problem is that the light source, again, in these microscopes, usually it's a 30-watt LED, 30-watt halogen light source. So again, when you actually try to do dark field with these Olympus microscopes, you're not really able to see everything that you should be able to see. So for an Olympus microscope, the type of Olympus microscope that will allow you to see all the anomalies properly in dark field, it would have to have a 100-watt halogen light source, or a 100-watt cold light source, a fiber optic light source. And when you then look at all the other specifications that are provided in our microscopes, the 5 types of objectives, the 100 times objective with a built-in iris diaphragm, and all those, if you compare those spec for spec, you actually will find that the Olympus is a lot more expensive. In terms of the CX41, the 30-watt Olympus microscope system, the cost price is around the same as our 9-watt LED systems, but then you have a microscope system with a very well-known, reputable brand, but you're not really going to be able to use it for dark field analysis.
Thank you. And are you still offering free shipping on your microscopes?
Yes, absolutely. Free shipping is still included. We ship with DHL, so it's really quite fast and quite reliable, and it's completely, you can track the progress during the whole process as well.
What is the warranty on your microscopes?
Well, warranty, we actually provide a 2-year warranty on the system. Industry standard is usually 1 year, but we're able to do 2 years just because of the build quality of the microscopes. They really quite reliable and resilient. So there's not really much that can go wrong in these systems. But in the event if something does happen, the warranty covers any type of issues. And usually, if there's a faulty part, we would ship a replacement part directly to you with DHL as well.
Thank you. And what are the most important differences regarding cameras and halogen and LED lighting? What are the most important differences regarding them?
Yeah, I think with regards to the models that we do have available, the types of cameras, there's actually quite a substantial difference between the types of cameras. The standard definition camera is a USB type of camera that connects to the computer. It's also compatible with Windows and Mac, and the definition is not poor. It's not that you'd have a terribly pixelated image. It works quite well, but the HD camera that we use now, that's standard with our HD LED system, is actually an HDMI USB camera. This is the latest actually in microscopy cameras. It connects via USB directly to the computer and provides a very good, high quality, high definition image, and everything is adjusted automatically within the camera between bright field and dark field. So there's no need to adjust settings or exposure values or anything like that. And then it has a separate output via HDMI that connects directly to an external monitor. Now, the benefit with that, which is quite nice, is that as the practitioner, if you're sitting with your client across the desk from you, you're able to view their blood sample on your computer screen, but then you have the option to have a separate monitor facing the client that's connected to the camera via HDMI, where they actually have a full screen view of their blood, which is really quite nice. The other way that it's usually done then, if you have to connect a separate monitor without the HDMI option, is then to connect that monitor directly to your computer, but then you end up having a screen where there's still menus visible on the other monitor, so not really ideal.
Okay, thank you. And one final question. If you do have any more questions, please put them in the box. If I buy a microscope now, is it likely to go out of date soon?
Well, microscopes haven't really changed that dramatically. The lenses and the components and so on have all remained fairly similar to what they used to be. The main changes have been with the type of light source. So the LED, which is something I also didn't mention earlier, the difference between LED and halogen. Halogen is the sort of standard that was always used for microscopes. It produces a type of very similar to a pure white light with halogen, but it does create a lot of heat. So a 50-watt halogen system, which is the minimum type of halogen light needed for dark field, would really create quite a lot of heat. So those components are then the actual light bulb is then housed outside of the microscope, usually at the back of the microscope in a separate box, and the light is then diverted into the microscope. This is often referred to as cooler illumination, if you've seen that term anywhere. But LED has been the latest development in microscopes, and there's a big move where microscopes are now featuring more and more LED illumination. Previously, it wasn't really used because it wasn't really possible to dim LED properly, but nowadays we're able to actually dim LED, so we're able to reduce the brightness. And the benefit with LED, of course, is that it has a very long lifespan, up to 25 years. There's no need to change a light bulb. It works. It keeps its level of brightness. It doesn't change. It stays completely white. So that is actually the latest feature, and the 9-watt LED that we have in our microscopes is actually a few years ahead of what is available from other manufacturers at the moment. So that's unlikely to really change. Cameras might change in the future. That's something that is constantly being developed, and obviously operating systems also change. But that's just an attachment. That's something that can be replaced and upgraded at a later stage. But the microscope itself, is not something that you're likely to have to replace any, upgrade any components as it stands at the moment.
Thank you. And is it possible to update the entry-level microscope to the level of the more expensive ones?
To a certain extent, you would be able to. You are, of course, able to add those 2 additional objectives, the 20 times and 100 times objective. You're able to add them, and the process is fairly simple. It's really just a matter of screwing those objectives into place into the nose piece. So that's something that can be done. You are able to upgrade the camera to a HDMI USB camera. That will also make quite a big difference. And the only difference would be then the strength of the LED light. It is possible to replace and upgrade the base of the microscope, the foot of the microscope, but then it will become then it will become costly. It would probably cost you a little more then in total than the top of the range microscope would cost you. But then you obviously have the option to upgrade it as you go along.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Please put them in the box there. So thank you very much for that. Very interesting. And please let us know if you would like more information on any of the microscopes that we've mentioned today, and also on the entry-level microscope. We'll be very happy to help and advise. So anything to add to that, Dr. Ocker?
Well, you know, something that we are able to do because of you know, the availability of things like Skype nowadays, if there's a need to actually see what live samples look like under a microscope, if an attendee would like to see, we can always arrange a Skype session, and you know, there's the option to share the screen, so I can actually show them live from the actual microscope what the samples would look like.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much for that, and thank you very much for joining us. And thank you very much, Dr. Ocker. Thank you and goodbye.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.